Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Massive turnout, as you can see. We're just going to start the talks off. You know, we're supported by the Arts Council of Northern Ireland to deliver 6 exhibitions a year, which last a month long. And this is one of them. This is the 10th version of Materials, Messages and Meaning that we've done. So thanks for everybody responding to the theme. What's it called again?
Borders, boundaries and bridges.
I like the theme threes for some reason. So this is the 10th version of it, and we invite the artists just to talk about their practice or the piece that they've entered into this exhibition. So I'll ask Maeve to start off because I know she's eager.
Everyone will laugh who knows me because I talk a lot, but I'm actually pretty crap talking about my own stuff, so I did write some notes. Which reminds me what to say. So first of all is to introduce myself. Obviously, like lots of you know me, which makes it a much better situation. But yes, I'm Maeve, and I am a visual artist. I studied glassmaking, which is why you can see some glass in the pictures, but I don't really call myself a glass artist anymore, partly because of access to equipment, which I can't very readily, and secondly because I just kind of find myself drawn to other things, other materials. So thank you for including me in the show. Applied a few times, so it's nice to get accepted, and maybe you just have to wait till the right one comes along. Certainly borders, boundaries and bridges, or whatever order it comes up in, was something that I was like, ooh, I should apply to that. Maybe not a very literal interpretation, but how I described it was that a lot of the time in my work, the stuff, the subjects or the objects are kind of on the boundary of existing or not existing. A lot of the time, often they're breaking or barely holding together. A lot of the time the work is sort of connected to things that are very ephemeral or transient. So it's things like the reflections or shadows, or in the sort of more photography elements, it's like when they're very fleeting moments. So yeah, connections of stuff that's hardly there, and kind of connected in ways that are very, very transient. So yeah. Will I talk about each piece individually? Is that something useful to talk about?
Yeah, give us a few references to things.
So these 3 pieces are probably the newest piece. I tend to work in series. I don't know why exactly that is. I don't know if that's sort of a craft thing. You kind of have to work things out, sort of like think through making and work things out. So I don't usually have like an idea for what something's going to be, but it's kind of the process of figuring out things. You end up with loads anyway, and I think I have a hard time narrowing it down, or I think that things just kind of look better collectively. So yeah, this series is called Window in Reverse, and essentially they're like glass line drawings of windows. They're made with the flame working process, which is where you use like borosilicate glass and a hot oxygen propane torch to basically kind of write with this, with these glass rods on like a kiln shelf. It can be a pretty quick process, but like these actually take ages for something that's really looks quite simple, because to put all of this sort of texture in it, which is what captures the light better, you actually sort of stamp it with like a metal stamp. So, and then each individual joint has to be kind of fused together so it won't pop back open and apart. So, yeah, I think anyone with eyes can see there's similarities between empty window, but yeah, certainly maybe coming from a glass sort of BA, it's always something that I have in my work, even though it's not necessarily, or that I'm interested in as material, because of all the kind of qualities that it has that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, it's a recurring theme, even if I don't exclusively work in it anymore. So would be time for questions later if you're interested in anything more. This piece is called Groundhogging One, but still spectacularly fucked. Apologies for the language. And this one is about how much effort you can put into something. Like, as I mentioned, a lot of my processes are very labor intense, and this is basically about how much effort you can put into something, and it really goes nowhere. You know, you put in a huge amount of effort to get something to look a certain way, but it's still basically falling apart. You can judge it up, you can put silver leaf on it, you can put it in a stand, but you know, it's still definitely breaking. And yeah, it's kind of reflecting on the amount of times that we do that in life, that we really just have stronger boundaries and say, no, I'm going to walk away. And then the last piece are these prints, which are from the newspaper Liminal Times, which is over there, and that was kind of a lockdown art, which by the way you can totally pick up and take off the wall and read. It's not precious, it kind of works better if you read it. And that was kind of like a lockdown diary, essentially. You know, all of our worlds sort of got very small all of a sudden. We spent an awful lot of time in our houses, walking the streets, looking in these windows of other people. And I think, yeah, windows and absence of windows and spaces is definitely like a recurring theme throughout it, and there were some words that I put together with it. That whole process sort of spawned a project that I've continued since, which is called Liminal Belfast, and we've been using alleyways as exhibition spaces. That was where these were first shown, actually, and that one, these ones. So yeah, it's kind of continued on from there.
Did you finance this project yourself, or was it?
No, it was, thanks Robert. No, it was funded by the Arts Council's emergency grants in the first instance, and then it kind of grew legs from there, and it was sort of commissioned through the Imagine Festival in its sort of second iteration last March, and then this year's one, which I'm not actually creating any work for, I've just sort of become project manager for, was slash curator, was funded by the Bank of Ireland Begin Together Arts Fund. So there's going to be version 3 this March. So yeah, it's kind of just an ongoing project in that sense. And I think I really like making things, and then in my other arts life, in my other arts life, I'm an event manager and project coordinator. So I think this is kind of where like worlds collided a little bit, because it was like, okay, you're making things, but you're also making things happen, and it's sort of the nature of the exhibitions, the very temporary and the very transitory, is kind of the same as my actual sort of sculptural work in my own studio practice. So yeah, it kind of brought the two worlds together. Because yeah, I always like making things, whether that's things with a material, or it's things with, you know, multiple parts and people and times and scheduling. I think there's an overlap in between both of them. So,
thanks for that.
Thank you.
Well, the beginning of this piece here was similar to what May was saying, that things happening in lockdown. Paul and I have known each other for a number of years, and during lockdown, Paul got in touch with me to say could he take a piece of my work and make some sound in relation to it. And it kind of started as a sort of a call and response conversation, during which we kind of swapped images or swapped sounds. And then we had a chance meeting prior to this show, and we were talking about that, and then we thought, well, this actually might work for this exhibition. So we decided to make another piece, and this time it was kind of, for me it was more complicated because I was suddenly thinking of it as being a piece with sound, as opposed to previously we'd just been kind of like making work. So it became very kind of self-conscious in terms of the making of the art piece. So what I did was, many years ago I used to work in the center school in Hollywood, and there in the early years they have a technique called wet on wet, where you're just letting pigment mix with water and kind of spread around and do its thing, and you don't have any real control over it. So that was useful for me because it took away the whole idea of applying paint in some kind of meaningful way, because I kept thinking of sound when I was applying it. So I wanted to stop thinking of what the sounds might be, and so this allowed me to do that. And then just letting these colours kind of spread, that kind of allowing the surface tension of water to really dictate where things went in accordance to how much liquid was applied at any one time. And the works previous to this here, the thing that was important to me was that the soundtrack wasn't a soundtrack as such. It wasn't kind of like, usually when images and words are put together, or what images and sound are put together, the sound is there either to kind of like support the images in some way, or like when images are put to sound, like in a music video or something, the images are there to support the sound. But for these pieces that we've been doing, it was very much a case of the sound and the image being a kind of a resonance together, not kind of like one playing the handmaiden of the other, but the two things kind of combining. So I made it and I sent it to Paul, and then what did you do, Paul?
Is that it? How you doing? My name's Paul McMurray. I'm a musician. As Robert has already said, our history goes way back. And as a musician with visual, we're all a musician's always subservient to the visual, and it's a role that I feel very home in. And when Robert sent me the video, we started to see sort of like the rippling effect of when you throw a pebble into water and you get the ripple. So that idea of the ink spraying is really what I was going for. So where Robert can only, well, in various techniques you can get a 3D effect, but with music I can create a pseudo 3D effect. So you put the headphones on, you can hear things somewhere over there, some over here, some in the back of the room, just because of the audio illusion that I can do with sound. And it's nothing more than just panning from from the left ear to the right ear, or staying in the middle. So I thought it was very conducive of how I see the visual, where although we see it spreading out like that, but we also realise that although we can't see it, the ink's going down that way. And as it more intensely is drawn downwards, the capillary action of the canvas makes it spread. So I was trying to capture that. And then when Robert was touching the ink on it, I felt as if there had to be some sort of way of marking time on that. And again, I'm working without a framework of time. Musicians like to have things in order, like 4 of this, 2 of that, 3 of that. And anybody that knows me knows that I don't do that. I do 12s and 14s and 38s, and why can't we have 739s in the middle of it all? Also, I don't subscribe to the idea of key. So this was nice because we're getting into a synthesis of understanding of notes where certain notes are represented by colours in some people's heads. I have a little bit of it, and yellow to me means this, blue means red means this, so I tried to stay away from what I conventionally knew and go in a different direction. So I trade under the name The Man-Made Machine, for the simple reason that I'll put in, once I get it all, I then put it into the computer and I set an algorithm to the computer, and I go, if at any time this note's hit, I want you to replace it with this, and if at any time this note's hit twice, I want you not to play it. So the computer itself has a mathematical algorithm that I'm beyond my ken of trying to understand what's going on in it. So this is the machine part of my duo. It's like, whatever the computer comes up with is the finished piece. I'm not in a position to argue with it, to go, oh, I know better than you, or I didn't like that. What you get is what the computer generates. So it's a very much a generative piece of music. In the same way that I think Robert has no control over the spread of the ink. There is a.
Yeah, you know it's going to spread, but you don't know how far.
Yeah, well, this is it. You know, depending how of the viscosity of the paint or whatever else. So for me, the music, whatever the outcome of the music is, that's it. I can either choose to accept that or run it again, in which case the algorithm will go completely different, and we'll have another piece of music. So sometimes you might see an album of mine called, I don't know, Module 1 to 14. It's the same piece of music that's been put through the algorithm 14 times, but it's a great way to create an album in a day, you know? But so what you're hearing is partly me, but mostly my computer. So. But I own the computer and I own the rights to it. So I think although the others have a completely subservient viewpoint to both of ourselves, but the two bits come together to make something greater. The sums are the whole's bigger than the parts, you know. But it's then allowing yourself to not have any ego in that I don't need to play a prima donna go, it's all about the music and you must. And likewise, Robert was more than capable. I've seen his work, I was going to say for 100 years, but maybe 50 years. I've seen his work and I understand how he works. But by nature, the two of us are very subservient people. I keep using that, but we just want to help each other. We just, no, you do your bit, I'll do my bit. And at the start, it's very hard because it's like, well, who starts?
Yeah.
So he'll send me something, I'll send him something, but it's like, I didn't mean to take the lead. It just, let's get the fire lit. Do you know what I mean? Once the fire's lit, it's like, well, you want to do this and do that. And again, we're open to interpretation where Robert will maybe say that doesn't work with that, or that works with that. But that's just his personal view, and if he feels so strongly about it, I'll just take it out. But likewise, we were talking about at the time about the brush, and how without the brush it's nice, because you just see the sort of the blotches of ink coming up, but with the brush it then adds a new set of timing to it. And visually looking at it from a point of view of having a timing, this irrational thing, I love that. I thought because you can't really go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. It's like 1, 2, 7, 9, no, 2,000, 400. Yeah. So that's us. That's what we've done.
Well, thanks, guys.
No, thank you.
Hello, my name is Sinead O'Donnell and I live in Belfast. I moved to Belfast when I was 19, so I actually have lived here longer than where I grew up in Dublin. So I consider myself a local. So I mainly work with performance art, and that's kind of driven from a history of fine art practice and sculpture. The piece I'm exhibiting is called Backward. I've developed this work over 10 or 15 years, not continuously, but maybe every 2 or 3 years I'm invited to make work, and I kind of think maybe the backward performance could work here, particularly if it's site specific or there's an opportunity for street intervention. Usually it could be different materials. So for example, in Serbia I walked very slowly backwards in the street with a cup and saucer in my hand. And I'd done this over a series of hours until somebody called paramedics and an ambulance came to take me away, because they thought I was possibly trying to incite war. And I've been working in that country since 2002, so there's a lot of post-traumatic trauma from the war. And then I went into a situation in Taiwan where it was a bigger piece because it was such a populated, the cities are very populated and everybody's on a moped and everybody's going in the same direction. So I thought, okay, walking backwards is going to work here. because I'm completely obstructing the flow. The piece has many different layers, and one of the layers is approaching habit impairments or being neurodiverse in a world that still doesn't get the day-to-day struggles and barriers and boundaries that we face. I'm a dyslexic person. I also would have mental health issues, and I would struggle a little bit physically. So walking backwards is a way of seeing the world maybe in a dyslexic way, or you're changing the direction of a city or a space or a wall or a park or a street, and you go backwards. So every day we go forwards and we go on with these routines, and we forget to look. We forget to look at where we are. We take where we are for granted. So by walking backwards, you can actually feel the fractures in the architecture, the fractures in society. And by working very, very, very slowly, even like an incidental audience are kind of look and go, right, okay, so there's something different about what this woman is doing, because she's walking backwards. And now she's taking these paper bags out. So in this piece, it was on the Derry City walls, and I had support from the lovely Zara Linus and Greg McCarthy, who runs Abridged, which is a beautiful visual art and poetry magazine, which is free. And they commissioned 3 artists to make work for like an on-screen version of Abridged. So everyone's working through the pandemic and trying to figure out different ways of managing their organisations and galleries, commissioning artists, how are artists going to cope with making work during this time. So I just basically went to Derry, put my handbag in a plastic bag down an alleyway, and took my white bags and went up onto the walls, and I was quite nervous. But after a little while, you have little interactions like this with these 2 ladies. They're from somewhere in England, their accents weren't London, and they weren't Napoleon, and I couldn't place where they were. But they were just kind of chatting, what are you doing? And, oh, you're doing art, and I was explaining to them it's kind of like a living sculpture. And then they started to kind of go, all right, okay. There was a lot of school children that came out, there was passers-by, but nobody was aggressive. Nobody was like, oh, what are you doing? They were very accepting. And because I'm not from Derry, it was a great way to kind of get to know the people and the movement of the people and their vibrations and how they felt. And so it was, I really enjoyed this piece, because sometimes when you're making work, sometimes you enjoy it, sometimes you don't, sometimes it's really difficult. And so this is a little bit about what I do, and it's also another way of dealing with lockdowns and restrictions. And when I make a performance, I can be by myself, I can be inside myself making the work. So Robert is right, like sitting here talking to you is more nerve-wracking for me than going out in public and making work. And then I started to think today on the train, maybe, because there's many layers for the reason that artists go in different directions with their practice, but I kind of feel that exhibiting my work in a group show and not performing and it being on the screen, I kind of think maybe these situations or social situations have always been a bit uncomfortable for me. I don't mean that in a way that our space is very warm and everyone's really lovely, but I think that I kind of realised maybe I do have a little bit of social anxiety, and maybe that's been amplified since the lockdowns and pandemic. So I think yeah, probably for the first time I'm thinking, yeah, okay, I can exhibit my work this way, and I can do this and I can do this with a little nudge from some friends. But I think that the exhibition itself is fantastic. There's like a narrative, the work is communicating, and I'm really happy to be included. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
These are a series of pieces I made. It's I do quite a lot of travelling by bike across the world. Well, I did before this nonsense happened. Hopefully I will again. But essentially, in relation to the theme of borders and boundaries and bridges, which I think is the most relevant way of approaching it, is that I've always, most of my work is about borders and about crossing borders and not crossing borders, and having the freedom to do it with basically a Western passport and money and privilege, where a lot of people don't. And equally, so do birds, so do animals, and they just don't see borders. And there's an awful lot of countries across the world where borders are irrelevant because of tribal groups and family groups. And unfortunately, it's people with generous suits and crowns and political sway who've drawn lines on maps, and that's what causes problems. So a lot of these journeys were in parts of the world where borders are important or not important, depending on your viewpoint. And travelling by bicycle, and very low-key and small scale and non-threatening looking, you can get away with beetling about and nobody really pays you much attention, which is great. So I basically do these trips, or did do these trips, and with my partner, and I suppose each of these describe a trip that has been made over the last, I suppose, 10 or so years. And then I generally, because you've only got panniers, you can't carry too much stuff, so I tend to, just as wee souvenirs, pick things up as I go along, and they tend to be just wee small things. And then when I started making these pieces, I started thinking about how small personal things, when you're travelling or when you're on the move or when you're fleeing, become very significant. So it might be, lucky charm or an amulet or a practical thing like a penknife, a torch. And these are the things that you carry with you. So these are, to some degree, things that I picked up along the way, and also things that were given me, or collected, or literally lifted off the road as I went along. The wings, it might seem a bit odd, but I don't know whether I was thinking about the series of work as I was going along one trip, but I actually started lifting birds' wings off the road as I went, and stuffed them in my panniers and brought them back and cast them. And it just sort of was, I suppose, one of the more recent trips we did was along the Danube we started in the previous year from the Black Sea, or from the Black Forest in Germany, and then ended up in the Black Sea in Constanța in eastern Romania. So this was the second year where we'd actually started from Budapest and gone through Belgrade, Novi Sad, Croatia, Serbia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and into Romania. But you sort of zigzag over the borders, and that's where I started lifting the birds' wings. And I started also noticing that whilst we were travelling east, there was an awful lot of people travelling west, and that was probably the last pre-COVID phase that everybody was aware of, where lots and lots and lots of people were fleeing to the west. So it became a bit of a kind of just an observation of the fact that we were going east for pleasure, and everybody else seemed to be coming west for economic and socio-political reasons. So really, I suppose that's sort of largely what these are about. They're different countries, as you can probably work out. I think we've got trips in Mozambique, and there's the Eastern European ones, and then Laos, Cambodia, Himalayas, and then obviously again quite poignantly we did a trip pre-war through Syria and Jordan, And the thing is about, that's this one here, and the thing is about this is that quite a lot of the objects were given to me doing, I suppose, what would be best described as a drinking game. The idea of doing a drinking game in Aleppo with a Sunni Muslim in his antique shop on Baghdad Street is kind of a bit interesting. But the drinking game involved, like, every time he would produce objects and we would talk about them, and then we'd have a drink, and then you'd win them or not win them. So that's quite a lot of things there. But the interesting thing about that is obviously there's towns there that don't exist more or less anymore. They've been sort of bombed into the Stone Age, as they say. They do exist, of course they exist, but they're just not in the form that they were. And I suppose that's sort of similar with quite a lot of these places. So that's really about
Your Romanian dog story.
Well, the Romanian dog story is not relevant in the slightest, but that's another thing, sort of obsession I have is with dogs and the notion of dogs. A lot of the places that you travel, there's dogs, and a lot of places where there's been political upheaval, there seems to be a lot of stray dogs, and to me the stray dogs kind of always became a metaphor for the disruption and the general upheaval within the country. And then particularly in Romania, well, obviously the Danube trip finished up in, it became apparent that you would cycle through towns that basically had nobody in, apart from, you know, a couple of alcoholics, few old people, and lots of dogs. And essentially, with political upheaval, you know, everything just goes to pot, and dogs get thrown out, people get thrown out, and everybody's just like. So the dogs are interesting. There's more work to be done with the dogs. I did do a series of work some time ago that we called Dogs and Other Stories, which was to do with a previous trip I'd done through Transylvania and through Hungary. Well, it was actually from Bucharest to Zagreb, and you know, all the time the dogs were always there. And dogs are quite interesting because they bark and 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 bark until a particular point just before the dawn when they go really quiet, and then they stop, and then they start again. And it's like this sort of weird kind of cyclical thing about dogs. So anyway,
Thanks for the dog
more
story.
dogs in the future.
I might have an exhibition about dogs then.
I'm Rebecca Flockaday. I'm currently studying at Ulster University doing photography with video, but over the past 3 years I've been more interested in performance art and like how I can use my own body to perform elements of my subject matter to the camera. I'm really excited to have been like accepted within this exhibition, because I've been coming here since I was maybe like 15, 16, and I studied at CERC and I've been coming along here ever since. So like growing as like a performance artist, I've been looking at a lot of different types of artists, and I'm so excited to be also presenting work along with Sinead O'Donnell. I'm interested in Northern Irish politics, how Brexit has affected our country, and like how it might affect like our future as a young person and trying to grow up within all that. So the tension that's always been here, but then over the past couple of years, how it's been like regrew again. So like, and how people from my generation understand that more than what I have over the past few years. So I've used the Farmer's Gate to create a boundary that kind of reflects this in Northern Ireland. So like a boundary between like trying to do something and doing it. So like trying to make a voice but not being heard. And I thought the gate would be a good way, because like a Farmer's Gate, it's like you can't go beyond that because that's private land, and like that boundary where it's public to walk past but not beyond. And I feel like growing up like in a younger generation with all this tension, it's just like we're being affected but haven't been able to like state anything because we're too young. It's always been older people making the decisions for our future to carry on with. And I think like Brexit was a huge thing of that, because when I was maybe like 14, 15, so I wasn't old enough to say like vote on it, but yeah, it was a decision that was made that will impact like my future and other people's future at my age. So like, and then like how do you, and then when we go to say something, we're never heard, or like new ideas have been brought to the table, whereas like it's always the older generation feeding us. So like I feel like that a lot of that tension that we are seeing now that's happened all summer has been a lot of like older generation feeding younger people, and like I've never grew up like that, so I never really understood what was being said and what is being done, so that was a boundary to me. So I used the gate to set this boundary for me and like push myself to then fail. So like fail is like fail of trying to say something, fail of trying to create art, and a failure within our structure that's always been there.